Hi, welcome to our channel, Mundelein Church of the Nazarene, and our second episode of our series, Not What You Think. We're presenting maybe a fresh look at some of the theological doctrines of the church, but probably in a way that maybe you might not be familiar with. Today we're going to talk about the atonement and the person of Jesus Christ. In short, we're kind of wanting to answer the question, what do we mean when we say somehow the death of Jesus Christ has an effect on me today? That seems like a strange thing to say about something that happened 2,000 years ago. For years, the existence of Jesus has been disputed. Historians and scholars have stated that there is no evidence that there's a person named Jesus who ever lived. So they claimed it was a figment of the imagination. A character that was invented. Other people say he was just an everyman of the first century. Oh, he might have been a peasant or maybe somehow a kind of a poor revolutionary leader, someone who spoke apocalyptically about the kingdom of God. And when he died, these other people placed all these words in his mouth and made him kind of a posthumous front man for this new religion. And his name got thrown in with this band of people who wanted to start something new. But we know from history that Jesus existed. We know it from the four Gospels we have. Yes, they're in the Christian New Testament, but these are also historical documents. We also know it from a host of other works that are not in our New Testament. You might have heard some of these, the Gospel of Thomas, or even the Gospel of Judas that made a little splash about a decade ago. We also know Jesus is referenced in Philo, in the Roman historian Suetonius, and Josephus. We also know that a whole movement, a change of history, started because these unlikely people, common people, claimed that this Jesus somehow changed them. And it went beyond them. This Jesus changed the entire Roman Empire. It took more than a few generations, but this ragtag group of 12 people that grew to dozens and then grew to hundreds eventually became the official religion of the Roman Empire less than 300 years later. So we know that the ancient Jews were expecting a Messiah to come and change their fortunes. This is a well-established, long-held belief of Judaism. They wanted this Messiah to defeat their enemies. He wanted this Messiah to bring freedom. And so if you're in any part of Israel's history, that meant you wanted Israel's enemies to be destroyed. You wanted Egypt to be destroyed. You wanted the Midianites to be destroyed. You wanted Babylon to be destroyed. All these powers are much greater than Israel. Israel was just a small, wandering tribe. And yet when Jesus came and started talking in language that would have been familiar to these Jewish believers, some of them expected that kind of thing to happen. We think maybe Judas and even Peter were part of this group who signed up so they could be part of this overthrow of the great power of Rome. And then Jesus did absolutely none of that. He didn't defeat a single battalion. He didn't lead an army in a single battle. He didn't try to set up an alternative government. He just talked, saw his crowd shrink, offended the powers that be, and then the Jews and the Romans and the people got together and yelled, "Crucify him," and used the Jewish law as pretext. And then he was put to death. And yet somehow his influence lived on and grew bigger. Well, why did his influence linger? I have to say, as a Messiah, Jesus was a total and complete flop. A failure. He did nothing that they expected. Didn't set up a government, had no power or anything. If you just waited a year or two, there'd be far more successful messiahs come along, people that actually took up arms, people that actually won a battle or tried to set up an alternative government. Those are actually what messiahs were supposed to do. Those names have been lost in history. This one person still lingers 2,000 years later. What would make these ordinary people attach this title, Messiah, to this one person, Jesus Christ? What if the enemies that were to be defeated were not Rome or Babylon? What if the enemies that were to be defeated was death and disease and sin itself? This is what the early believers believed. And they were left to grapple with what this meant and grapple with how this happened. How this process happened, how this life and death of Jesus Christ changed the world is called the Atonement. How did Jesus change my life? Many Christians even today say this is true. But what if I said maybe it's not entirely true? A few years ago, family was on vacation. We ended up coming back a day early. My wife had someone in her family that was in the hospital, so we drove all the way back, I think from Colorado, all in one day. We got back at 3 in the morning. It was a late Saturday night. Family went to bed very, very late. And of course, they slept in. I was up at the normal time. And so I got in my car, and I drove down to one of these mega churches that was not too far from my house. I walked in the Sunday morning service. I just kind of wanted to see what was going on. Luckily, or for me that day, they were doing a baptism service. They had 7 people that were going to be baptized. At the end of the service, they stood up in front, and the pastor asked them a series of questions. First one was, do you believe that Jesus was God? Do you believe that Jesus is your personal Savior? And does Jesus save you now? And they responded yes to all those questions, and then the pastor baptized them, brought them up out of the water, everybody clapped, and they'd move on to the next candidate. Happened to all 7 people. At the close of the service, they closed, and the pastor made a beeline right for me. I kind of expected that. I was the new face. And he came up to me, and he said, we're so glad you're here. And I said, well, it was wonderful to be here. And he said, you have any questions about what you saw? I said, yes, I have one big one. And he said, what's that? And I said, I saw that you had 7 people baptized. And he goes, yeah, it's wonderful. And I said, yet in none of those 7 people being baptized did I ever hear the word resurrection. Why is that? He was a little flummoxed, and I said, have a nice day. And I turned and walked away. I kind of like to drop bombs sometimes and walk off. There's a common mistake that we make. And that is exactly what this atonement means. We like to say, Jesus died for my sins. And yes, that's true. But even in the church today, we completely leave out the resurrection. And that's the lead story. I don't want to do that. Let me give you 2 different pictures of the atonement. The first one might be one you're very familiar with. And that's this. God created the heavens and the earth. He created humanity and placed them in a perfect situation. And what happened was Adam sinned. He knew the law. He knew not to eat of the one tree in the middle of the garden. For some reason, we always say apple tree. I'm kind of a Midwesterner. I think apple's far too pure of a fruit to be involved in this kind of nefarious activity. Whatever the fruit was, he ate of the fruit. And it was a sin. And then Eve participated also, and they both were kicked out. So we are the ones who sinned. We transgressed. We went against God, and were removed from this perfect environment. And because we sinned, the penalty is death. God cannot look upon sin. And so the only proper penalty is death. So thankfully for us, God sent his Son, who came and he went to the cross in my place. He died for me. And because Jesus died, he paid my penalty. I'm now free from that penalty, and I can go free. I've been judged right because my penalty was paid for someone else. And so we are thankful that Jesus died in my place. That is called the atonement. If you've noticed something else, there's another word that I didn't say in that description, and it was, again, resurrection. If we're leaving out resurrection from our description of what happens, could it be that maybe our understanding is maybe incomplete as well? Let me try this again from a different perspective. We, as human beings, we have a weight that works against us. That weight is sin. Sure, we willingly participated, and much of that weight is of our own doing. But we inherit a lot of that. We struggle with selfishness because Grandpa struggled with selfishness. We struggle with pride because Mom struggled with pride. We bear the weight of all the accumulated stuff that goes before us. So what do we do with that? So Jesus came, and he took on all of that weight. The law that was supposed to guide us was used in his death. They used the law to pronounce death on Jesus Christ. And the people yelled, "Crucify him," and Jesus died. The law was used against Jesus. Here's the good news. On the third day, Jesus rose again. So whatever power the law had, whatever power sin had, and all the written regulations with the resurrection was broken forever. And he offers that new life for us. It's not just a legal requirement. It's not just our penalty has been paid. In the previous description, yes, my penalty's been paid, but that system that finds me guilty still is in control. In my second presentation, the whole system that found me guilty is what was smashed when Jesus rose from the dead. So I can have new life. Jesus did not come to make bad men good. He came to make dead people alive. That's the resurrection. But let me not stop there. In any discussion of the atonement, we have to remember Jesus not only rose from the dead, the creeds say he ascended into heaven, where he sits at the right hand of God the Father. The atonement's not just a historical event. Jesus is alive today and acts in our behalf. God the Son is our advocate. He pleads the case for us. He's rooting for us. He stands in our corner, so much so that he went to a cross and rose again for us. This might be good news for any of you who grew up in a place where God was just waiting for us to get out of line so he could zap us and teach us a lesson and judge us. So our Christianity has become a way to avoid punishment, which our first description of the atonement fits. That's not really what it's all about. So we serve a God who loved us enough. He not only came, he willingly sacrificed. And Jesus rose again and offers that same new life for us. And he's alive today and roots for us and stands in our corner and acts in our behalf if we'll just let him do so. That's the atonement. It might be a little different. I hope it helped. I'd like you to subscribe to the channel or just like this video, but we'll be back every week and we'll take on a new theological topic for the next few weeks. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.